Her name was Sarah Davis Mitchell, a widow at 24 years of age, nearly 8 months pregnant, and bound to a family of in-laws who had not even waited for the soil to settle over her husband's grave, before making it agonizingly clear that she was no longer welcome. Ethan Mitchell had perished from a sudden, blunt blow to the head. He had tumbled from the high barn roof he was patching on a windy Tuesday in October, completely alone, with not a single soul around to witness his tragic descent. The ranch hands discovered him as the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Montana mountains. By the time the town doctor arrived from the valley, the cold mountain air had already claimed him, and there was absolutely nothing left to be done. Sarah could not even muster the breath to scream when the sheriff delivered the devastating news. She merely stood paralyzed on the sweeping wraparound porch of the main house, her trembling hands instinctively cradling her swollen belly, as the vast, sprawling world of the cattle ranch spun violently around her, entirely out of her control. She had been 7 months pregnant at the time. For weeks, Ethan had been whispering to her to take it easy, to rest her aching back, promising her with that gentle, crooked smile that he would take care of absolutely everything. And then, in the blink of an eye, he had taken care of dying, leaving her adrift in a sea of hostility. The Mitchells were a legacy ranching family, the sort of people who owned thousands of acres of prime valley soil, boasted a surname that commanded silent deference at the local bank, and firmly believed that such material wealth was more than enough to elevate them above the common folk. Robert Mitchell, her stern father-in-law, was a man carved from granite. He possessed very few words, and even fewer genuine sentiments. Alice Mitchell, her mother-in-law, was a master of the polite, chilling facade. She was the kind of woman who would offer a sweet, flawlessly painted smile to your face, right before driving a metaphorical blade deep into your back. Sarah's brothers-in-law, Henry and Bradley, had never harbored an ounce of affection for her from the very first day she arrived. Their disdain was rooted in the simple fact that Ethan had brought her in from the outside, from a dusty, struggling logging town 2 hours away, without ever seeking their permission or their arrogant approval. To them, Sarah was an interloper, a penniless girl who had somehow managed to trick the golden boy of the Mitchell Empire into a quiet, modest courthouse marriage. They viewed her pregnancy not as a continuation of their brother's legacy, but as an inconvenient anchor, tying them to a woman they desperately wished to erase from their pristine family portrait. The air in the grand house had grown suffocating in the wake of the funeral. Ethan's boots had barely been cleared from the mudroom when the whispers began, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings and slipping beneath the heavy oak doors. Sarah spent her days confined to the small bedroom she had shared with her husband, surrounded by the haunting scent of his cedarwood cologne and the agonizing silence of his absence. She tried to make herself invisible, eating her meals long after the family had left the massive dining table, keeping her eyes downcast whenever she crossed paths with Robert's stony glare or Alice's sharp, calculating gaze. But invisibility is a poor shield against people who have already decided your fate. The grief was a heavy, suffocating blanket, yet the isolation was far worse. She was marooned on an island of unimaginable sorrow, surrounded by a sea of people who shared her husband's blood, but none of his boundless, fiercely protective heart. 3 weeks precisely after the somber dirt had been thrown onto Ethan's polished casket, Alice Mitchell let herself into the bedroom where Sarah was resting. She did not knock. She simply glided in, dragged a heavy wooden chair right up to the edge of the mattress, and seated herself with the absolute, terrifying posture of a woman who had already finalized her decisions long before she ever bothered to open her mouth. Her perfectly coiffed hair and immaculate pearl necklace starkly contrasted with the grim, unfeeling nature of her visit. "This house is going to need the bedroom," Alice stated, her voice as smooth and cold as river ice. "Henry is getting married in January, and his new bride will not tolerate being relegated to the guest wing. Sarah looked up, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I am pregnant, Alice. I am carrying Ethan's child. I am quite aware of your condition," Alice replied, her expression entirely, completely, utterly devoid of pity. "That is precisely why I am giving you the courtesy of a few days' notice. You need to make arrangements." There were no further words exchanged. There was no elaborate explanation, no hollow apology, no feigned sympathy. There was nothing but that freezing tone, and the chair pushed aggressively close to the bed, functioning as a physical barrier and a silent testament that the conversation had concluded before it had truly begun. Sarah took 4 torturous days to gather her meager belongings. There was honestly not much to pack. Her entire life fit seamlessly into the battered cardboard suitcase she had originally brought with her when she first married Ethan. She packed a handful of framed photographs capturing his bright, unburdened smile, her silver rosary, a few maternity dresses, and a thick, hand-woven wool blanket her own mother had given her as a wedding keepsake. On the morning of her departure, the frost was thick on the pasture grass. Alice did not emerge from her parlor to bid her farewell. Robert remained hidden away in his expansive study. Only Bradley was present in the frosty courtyard, wordlessly holding the leather reins of the chestnut horse. He shoved the leather straps toward her, deliberately avoiding her tear-filled eyes. "The sorrel was Ethan's," Bradley muttered brusquely, his breath pluming in the freezing morning air. "Take him." And with that single, dismissive sentence, he turned on his heel and vanished back into the warmth of the opulent estate. The horse's name was Lucky. He was a magnificent creature, a rich sorrel, with a dark, flowing mane, boasting a gentle but incredibly sturdy build. He possessed the tranquil, patient demeanor characteristic of animals that have known nothing but kindness. Ethan had cherished him deeply, meticulously brushing his coat every single morning before heading out to mend fences, speaking to the animal in hushed, affectionate tones as though the horse could comprehend every single syllable. Sarah carefully strapped her worn suitcase onto his broad back, secured her small sacks of meager provisions, and mounted the saddle with the profound, agonizing difficulty that accompanies an 8-month pregnancy. She hoisted herself up until she was seated securely, her massive belly resting heavily forward, her trembling gloved hands gripping the freezing leather reins. She cast one final, sweeping glance over the sprawling Mitchell estate, the freshly painted white fences, the grand stone facade of the main house, the immaculate rows of Alice's frost-covered rose bushes. She did not feel blinding rage. Instead, she felt something vastly heavier than anger, a profound, unnamed hollow weight that settles deep within the chest and stubbornly refuses to be dislodged. Then, with a soft click of her tongue, she gently pulled the reins, and Lucky began a slow, steady walk away from the only home she had left. The path Sarah directed Lucky toward was not the well-worn gravel road leading down into the bustling valley town. Instead, she chose the rugged, forgotten trail. It was the steep, winding dirt path that snaked northward up the flank of the towering mountain ridge, a treacherous route that the wealthy residents of Pine Creek rarely, if ever, traversed. It led into the dense, shadowed pine forests, toward a remote destination that most of the valley actively chose to ignore. It led directly to the secluded, weather-beaten cabin of Nana Cora Chayton Reynolds. That was the full, legal name of Ethan's paternal grandmother, although no one down at the sprawling valley ranch ever dared to speak her name aloud. To the haughty Mitchell family, she was merely the old native woman, a label spat out in hushed, venomous whispers, carrying that specific brand of elitist disgust that requires no raised voices to inflict deep, lasting damage. Robert Mitchell was her biological son, a fact he had ruthlessly excised from his personal history, just as one might violently tear an unwanted, shameful chapter from a beautifully bound book. He routinely lied to his wealthy peers, claiming his mother had perished tragically when he was merely a small boy. It was a vile, fabricated lie. Nana Cora lived 3 grueling hours up the steep mountain trail, residing in a modest, sturdy log cabin she had painstakingly erected with her own bare hands many decades ago. She had fled to the high country when the Mitchell family patriarchs had cruelly separated her from her own child, deeming her indigenous heritage and quiet, earthbound ways a profound embarrassment to their rising social status. Ethan had miraculously discovered her existence as a grown man, entirely by chance, when a grizzled mountain trapper happened to mention an old Reynolds woman living in absolute solitude up on the high North Ridge. Driven by an insatiable curiosity and a deep-seated feeling of incomplete identity, Ethan had ridden up the mountain and found his long-lost grandmother. From that fateful day forward, he had visited her in strict secrecy, never breathing a word of his journeys to his prejudiced parents or brothers. 2 years prior to his tragic fall, he had proudly taken Sarah up the treacherous path to meet her. Sarah had never forgotten the profound impact of that initial meeting. Nana Cora was a woman in her late 70s, her spine remarkably straight despite a lifetime of intense physical hardship. Her long, stark white hair was intricately braided, with vibrant, naturally dyed ribbons, and her dark, fiercely intelligent eyes seemed to pierce right through any superficial pretense. She spoke English with the rhythmic, deliberate cadence of someone who had grown up speaking an ancient Native American tongue before being forced to learn the language of the valley. When Ethan had introduced them, Nana Cora had studied Sarah with an intense, lingering gaze, and then, without seeking any permission, she had firmly grasped Sarah's trembling hands. "You will endure," the old woman had stated, her voice resonating like ancient river stones. "My grandson has chosen an extraordinary spirit." Sarah did not fully comprehend why that specific memory surged to the forefront of her exhausted mind now, but it anchored her as the steep trail wound higher and higher into the bitter mountain chill. The rocky path ascended sharply through towering lodgepole pines and golden aspens, with the imposing granite face of the mountain looming to her right, and the sprawling, arrogant valley falling away far to her left. The pale morning sun struck her from the side, offering a meager, fleeting warmth that briefly illuminated the frosted underbrush. Lucky marched forward without any hint of rushing, his hooves planting firmly on the treacherous dirt, and Sarah simply allowed him to dictate their pace, her grip on the leather reins comfortably loose. Her belly ached with a heavy, persistent pressure. The battered cardboard suitcase rhythmically bumped against the horse's flank with every step. Sarah rested one freezing hand on the saddle horn and the other protectively over her unborn child, feeling a sudden, strong kick. The baby's movements had grown increasingly urgent over the past few days, a frantic, rolling pressure, almost as if the tiny life inside her instinctively understood that their entire world had been irrevocably shattered and remade. Sarah finally arrived at the edge of Nana Cora's clearing shortly past noon, her entire body aching from the grueling ride. The cabin was a small, beautifully crafted structure of thick timber and mountain stone, topped with a pitched tin roof that glinted under the high sun. A narrow, welcoming wooden porch spanned the front, heavily adorned with hanging bundles of dried sweetgrass, sage, yarrow, and wild mint. A scruffy, loyal brown dog was dozing peacefully on the worn threshold, lifting its head to offer a lazy thump of its tail. Adjacent to the cabin lay a meticulously maintained garden, boasting perfectly aligned rows of winter-hardy root vegetables and medicinal herbs, all sheltered beneath the expansive, protective branches of an ancient, sprawling cedar tree. Nana Cora was seated comfortably on her porch, her weathered hands gracefully weaving a complex basket from damp willow shoots. The moment she heard the rhythmic crunch of Lucky's hooves breaking through the mountain silence, she slowly lifted her gaze. She did not display a single flicker of shock or surprise. She merely rested her weaving gently in her lap and waited with a stoic, timeless patience. Sarah painstakingly dismounted, her breathing shallow and ragged in the thin mountain air. The process was far more difficult than she had anticipated. Her severely swollen feet and the immense weight of her 8-month pregnancy violently threw off her center of gravity, forcing her to lean heavily against Lucky's warm flank to avoid collapsing into the dirt. Once she finally found her footing, she stood motionless before the sturdy wooden gate, clutching her pathetic cardboard suitcase, her throat locked tight, utterly incapable of forming a coherent sentence. Nana Cora rose smoothly, her movements belying her advanced age. She crossed the packed dirt yard, unlatched the heavy gate, and truly looked at the broken girl standing before her. She observed the massive swell of the pregnancy. She looked at the cheap, worn suitcase. She stared deeply into Sarah's bloodshot eyes, recognizing the distinct, hollow redness that only belongs to someone who has wept until their very soul is completely parched of tears. "I know," Nana Cora said, her voice a low, comforting rumble. "The mountain wind carried the news of my Ethan." Sarah desperately opened her mouth to speak, to offer some explanation, but her vocal cords simply refused to cooperate. A single, ragged sob escaped her lips instead. "Come inside the warmth," the elderly woman commanded gently. "The horse can rest in the lean-to alongside my old mare." The interior of the log cabin was small, yet it possessed an immaculate, deeply comforting order. There was a cozy main room featuring 2 sturdy, hand-carved wooden chairs and a long bench covered in thick animal pelts. A modest kitchen area boasted a black cast-iron wood stove with gleaming copper pots suspended neatly along the timber walls. A private room sat quietly at the back, its bed perfectly made, everything meticulously clean, reflecting the profound care of a woman who lives entirely alone and fiercely protects the precious little she possesses, because she intimately knows the agonizing cost of acquiring it. Nana Cora immediately set an iron kettle to boil, brewing a strong, fragrant tea of wild chamomile and dark mountain honey. She poured the steaming liquid into 2 heavy ceramic mugs and took a seat directly across from Sarah at the small pine table. "They threw you out into the cold?" she asked, her question blunt, slicing completely through any polite social maneuvering. "They informed me that they urgently required my bedroom," Sarah whispered, her hands tightly wrapping around the hot mug for warmth. Nana Cora nodded slowly, her expression devoid of shock. It was the solemn nod of a survivor, intimately acquainted with a recurring nightmare, because she had been the very first victim of its horrors. "The Mitchell family has operated in that exact cruel manner for generations," the old woman stated softly. "They consume the usefulness of human beings, and when they are sated, they discard them like spoiled meat. They executed the exact same violence upon me." Sarah sipped the hot, sweet tea, feeling its comforting warmth slowly settle her twisting stomach. "I have absolutely nowhere else to go, Nana Cora," she confessed, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek. "My family is a state away, and my pockets are completely empty. I had absolutely no one but Ethan." The elderly woman studied her intensely for a long, silent moment. "Your wandering ends today. You stay right here," she declared with absolute finality. "The back room belongs to you now. The child will draw its first breath in this mountain air, exactly as it should be." It was not a tentative question. It was not a polite offer designed to solicit desperate gratitude. It was an unbreakable declaration, delivered with the same unshakable firmness that characterized everything Nana Cora did. Deep within her chest, Sarah felt a massive, painful knot suddenly snap. Not the agonizing break of a bone, but the profound, liberating release of a crushing weight that had been threatening to suffocate her. She simply nodded, unable to speak, profoundly grateful for the unyielding strength of the woman sitting across from her. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, restorative rhythm. It was the unique, profound tranquility of 2 grief-stricken women who had suffered immeasurable losses and had subsequently learned the vital importance of never squandering whatever precious fragments remained. Sarah would awaken naturally with the soft purple light of the mountain dawn, while the crisp, high-altitude air still smelled heavily of damp earth, and the birds were just beginning to stir within the branches of the great cedar. Nana Cora, however, was always awake long before the sun dared to breach the horizon. She would quietly stoke the glowing embers of the iron stove, possessing an effortless, silent grace in her daily chores. The rich, earthy aroma of strong chicory coffee would quickly fill the compact cabin, drifting warmly out the slightly cracked front door and onto the dew-soaked porch. They would share their simple breakfasts together in a comfortable, heavy silence. It was never an awkward quiet. Rather, it was the deeply satisfying silence shared by two souls who no longer felt the exhausting need to fill the empty space with meaningless chatter just to validate their existence. Following their morning meal, Nana Cora took it upon herself to educate Sarah. She introduced the young widow to the vast pharmacy growing wild in the mountain soil. She meticulously explained which silver-leafed plant reduced fierce fevers, how to properly steep yarrow to mitigate the agonizing pains of late-stage pregnancy, and which specific crushed roots could be applied to the skin when a baby refused to settle into the proper position. She demonstrated how to create a thick, fragrant steam bath using cedar and sage to completely draw out the deep, bone-weary exhaustion that plagued Sarah's swollen body. Cora imparted this sacred knowledge with the tranquil, unshakable authority of a woman who had received these ancient teachings directly from her own grandmother, who had, in turn, learned from the grandmothers before her. It was a vast, invaluable well of indigenous wisdom that the arrogant Mitchell family had deliberately blinded themselves to, simply because it was wrapped in a native dialect and delivered by deeply calloused, brown hands. Sarah absorbed absolutely everything. She listened with an open heart and a desperate hunger to survive. She quickly learned to predict the approaching weather simply by observing the shifting shadows on the jagged mountain peaks, recognizing the exact, bruised color the clouds assumed just before a heavy snowfall, and deciphering the distinct scent of pine resin carried on a northern wind. She learned the tedious, rewarding process of grinding corn and preparing dough in the freezing pre-dawn hours. Furthermore, she learned how to expertly treat a painful limp in Lucky's front leg, applying a warm, soothing poultice that Nana Cora expertly mixed from river clay and crushed arnica flowers. During the crisp, golden afternoons, a secondary rhythm emerged. A man named Thomas, an elderly, silver-haired mountain postman who operated entirely off the grid, would occasionally ride up the trail on his sturdy mule. Thomas was one of the few valley folks who openly defied the Mitchell family's unspoken embargo on the ridge. He would bring heavy sacks of white flour, fresh blocks of salt, and quiet, respectful news from the town below, always refusing to take a single dime for his immense trouble, citing an old, unpaid debt he owed to Cora's late husband. His brief visits brought a small, necessary connection to the outside world, yet he always maintained a respectful distance, deeply honoring the sanctuary the two women had cultivated. When the evenings grew bitterly cold, the two women would retreat to the warmth of the roaring stove. Nana Cora would return to her intricate weaving, while Sarah would meticulously mend torn garments or simply sit quietly, her hands resting protectively on her massive belly, gazing out the window at a massive, star-choked sky that seemed infinitely larger and significantly brighter than any sky she had ever witnessed down in the polluted, electrically lit valley. In the safety of the darkness, they spoke of Ethan. Nana Cora recalled vibrant memories of him as a young, wild-hearted boy, long before the bitter Robert Mitchell had violently attempted to sever their profound connection. She recounted stories of how Ethan would sprint through the dense pine forests, chasing frightened marmots, how he deeply loved the taste of wild huckleberries mixed with honey, and how he used to endlessly question why the glittering stars never plummeted from the black canvas of the sky. She shared these precious fragments of his life in a soft, reverent whisper, a warm, genuine smile, completely transforming the deep lines of her weathered face. Sarah would simply listen, tears silently tracking down her cheeks, overwhelmed by an agonizing mixture of joy and sorrow. It was the only tangible method she possessed to continue learning about the man she desperately loved, precisely now that his physical form had been cruelly snatched away from her forever. It occurred on one of those freezing, wind-battered nights. Nana Cora abruptly ceased her weaving, allowing the intricate basket to rest motionless in her lap. She stared deeply into the crackling fire for a tremendously long time, entirely silent. Sarah noticed the shift in the cabin's energy and paused her mending, her needle hovering over a torn woolen sock. "Is everything all right, Nana?" Sarah asked softly, her voice carrying over the snapping of the burning pine. The elderly woman did not issue an immediate response. She appeared to be heavily weighing a monumental decision, a secret she had been actively sheltering for what felt like an eternity. "Ethan came to visit me," Nana Cora finally stated, her dark eyes locking onto Sarah's pale face. 3 weeks exactly before the mountain took him. Sarah completely froze, her breath caught tightly in her throat. "He rode up alone, cloaked in secrecy, exactly as he always did," Cora continued, her voice remarkably steady. "But on that specific day, his spirit was profoundly different. He was unusually quiet. He sat right where you are sitting, and he confessed that a dark premonition had firmly settled over his heart. He felt an undeniable certainty that a terrible shadow was approaching, and his absolute primary concern was ensuring that you would remain fully protected if he suddenly vanished from this earth." Sarah's heart began to hammer violently against her ribs, the loud thumping echoing loudly in her ears. "He left a heavy burden with me," Nana Cora revealed, slowly pushing herself up from the wooden chair. "He made me swear on the blood of our ancestors that if he perished before the child took its first breath, I was to deliver it directly into your hands, and absolutely no one else's." She moved gracefully across the room and disappeared into the shadowed confines of the back bedroom. Sarah heard the distinct creak of heavy wooden floorboards being shifted, the muffled scraping of something substantial being dragged across the dirt foundation. When Nana Cora emerged back into the flickering firelight, she was clutching a solid, heavy metal box. It was not particularly massive, roughly the size of a standard boot box, painted a chipped, matte black, and securely fastened shut with a heavy brass padlock. She set it down onto the center of the pine table with a resounding thud. "He entrusted me with the key as well," Nana Cora stated. Reaching deep into the massive pocket of her woven apron, she withdrew a small, jagged iron key, heavily bound by a thick piece of crimson woolen thread. Sarah stared blankly at the dark box, then shifted her gaze to the dangling key. Her hands shook violently as she reached out to accept it. "Do you possess any knowledge of what resides inside this?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the immense pressure. "No," Nana Cora answered truthfully, taking a respectful step back. Ethan explicitly stated that the contents were a sacred matter, exclusively between a husband and his wife. Trembling uncontrollably, Sarah grasped the heavy padlock and slid the iron key into the slot. It turned with a sharp, echoing click. She slowly pushed the heavy lid backward. Inside the dark interior lay a stack of impeccably folded documents, a thick, sealed envelope bearing her name, beautifully scripted in Ethan's unmistakable, meticulous handwriting, and beneath it all, a small, dark green, leather-bound ledger. She reached for the sealed envelope first, her fingers clumsily tearing the paper. Inside was a handwritten letter spanning 3 full pages, crammed with the tight, slanted cursive that Sarah knew more intimately than her own reflection. She read the ink-stained words in absolute, crushing silence. Nana Cora did not intrude. She simply waited by the fire, her hands politely folded in her lap. By the time Sarah reached the final paragraph, her face was completely drenched in tears. her jaw trembling violently. She carefully refolded the precious pages, slid them back into the torn envelope, and pressed the paper desperately against her chest, attempting to absorb the lingering essence of his soul. "What message did he leave you?" Nana Cora inquired softly, her voice barely rising above the howling wind outside. Sarah drew a massive, shuddering breath, attempting to steady her collapsing lungs. "He wrote that his love for me was entirely boundless," she choked out, fighting back a fresh wave of sobbing. "And he wrote that he bought me the land." Nana Cora's brow furrowed in deep confusion. "What land do you speak of?" Sarah reached back into the metal box and retrieved the thick stack of official papers lying beneath where the letter had been. She spread them out across the rough pine table. They were legal property deeds, heavy land grants heavily stamped with official county seals and notarized signatures. She traced the dense legal jargon with a shaking, reverent finger. Operating entirely in the shadows, Ethan had been quietly purchasing land. He had utilized every single dime he could secretly siphon away from his grueling labor at the ranch over the span of 3 agonizing years, purposely hiding his financial maneuvers from his controlling father. He had successfully secured 42 sprawling acres of incredibly fertile acreage, situated directly on the high North Ridge, physically bordering Nana Cora's own rugged plot. It was magnificent property, boasting a clean, running freshwater creek and vast, easily farmable clearings. And every single official document, every single registered deed, was legally bound entirely to Sarah's name. He had executed the entire complex transaction through an independent lawyer situated out in the distant city, purposefully ensuring the paperwork remained utterly invisible to the corrupt local officials under Robert Mitchell's heavy thumb. Inside the green leather ledger were detailed contact logs, the trusted city lawyer's direct telephone numbers, the specific registry codes, and the routing information for a private, offshore bank account containing a substantial sum of liquid cash, explicitly designated for the immediate construction of a secure home. Sarah slammed the leather ledger shut and looked directly at Nana Cora, her eyes blazing with a mixture of profound grief and awe. "He genuinely knew," she whispered, her voice completely breaking. "He felt the danger looming, and he meticulously orchestrated this entire safety net to guarantee that I would never, ever be cast out into the cold." Nana Cora offered a slow, deeply respectful nod. In her dark, ancient eyes swam a complex mixture of fierce, tribal pride and an agonizing, maternal sorrow. "My grandson possessed the heart of a true warrior," she murmured. "The Mitchell family never possessed the capacity to deserve a single drop of his blood." The child stubbornly decided to enter the world 22 days after the metal box was opened. It commenced in the dead of the freezing night, accompanied by a sudden, monstrous mountain thunderstorm that violently rattled the cabin's tin roof and shook the very foundation of the ridge with deafening, explosive thunderclaps. Nana Cora assumed the role of the midwife. She had performed the sacred duty countless times before, serving the deeply impoverished women of the high country who had absolutely nowhere else to turn when their agonizing hour finally arrived. Her weathered, steady hands intrinsically understood exactly what was required. She moved around the small bed with the supreme, unshakable calm that exclusively stems from a lifetime of witnessing the brutal, beautiful cycle of life and death, totally devoid of panic. Sarah refused to scream. She fiercely bit down on a rolled piece of thick leather, clamped her sweaty hands around Nana Cora's iron grip, and pushed with every ounce of her remaining strength whenever the elderly woman commanded her to bear down. The pain was absolute and blinding, a fiery tempest tearing through her spine. When the tiny, slippery infant finally slid from her body and drew its first, desperate gulp of freezing air, the absolute loudest peal of thunder of the entire night violently detonated across the mountain peaks, as if the very heavens were aggressively announcing the child's arrival. It was a perfectly healthy baby boy. They solemnly named him Ethan Chayton Mitchell. The first name proudly belonged to his fallen father. The second name, meaning falcon, in an ancient indigenous tongue, was an homage to the fierce, resilient grandmother who had caught him in her brown hands and welcomed him into the brutal world with a completely whole heart. The final name was the powerful surname the Valley family had so desperately attempted to sever from their lineage, a name that was now permanently anchored to a brilliant new life, growing high above their heads. The arduous months that immediately followed were heavily defined by relentless labor and rapid construction. Once Sarah had recovered enough strength, she rode Lucky down the mountain, carrying the wrapped child and the heavy metal box. She marched directly into the city lawyer's office, completely bypassing the local town authorities. The lawyer efficiently verified every single document. The 42 acres of prime land were legally hers, completely unassailable, backed by Ethan Mitchell's notarized signature recorded months prior to his tragic accident. There was absolutely no legal maneuver the wealthy Mitchell family could execute to reverse it, despite their vast fortunes. And they certainly attempted to do so. Robert Mitchell aggressively materialized one humid afternoon, accompanied by Henry and Bradley, tearing up the steep dirt trail in a massive black truck, violently churning up suffocating clouds of yellow dust. The three men stepped out of the vehicle projecting the arrogant, furious aura of individuals accustomed to bending the entire universe to their specific whims. Robert completely ignored standard greetings. He marched directly toward the wooden gate, his face flushed with unbridled rage. "That property belongs entirely to the Mitchell estate," Robert barked, pointing a thick, accusing finger toward the rolling green acres. "Ethan was a Mitchell. That dirt is ours." Sarah was standing calmly on the shaded porch, clutching little Ethan firmly against her chest. She did not take a single step backward. "The land is legally registered entirely under my name, Robert," she replied, her voice ringing out remarkably clear and devoid of any fear. "It has been mine for 3 solid years. You are welcome to review the city records, if you possess the capability to read them." He refused to even glance at the copies she held out. "My high-priced lawyers will dismantle your little charade by the end of the week," he threatened, his voice dripping with pure malice. "You may employ every single corrupt lawyer situated in this entire state," Sarah countered smoothly. "The registry is completely ironclad. Ethan executed the purchase perfectly. He outsmarted you." Robert Mitchell glared at her with a furious, baffled expression, entirely unaccustomed to facing direct, unyielding defiance from anyone, let alone a woman he had so casually discarded. Then, his angry gaze drifted past Sarah's shoulder. He stared at the cabin, the flourishing garden, and finally, his eyes locked onto Nana Cora. The elderly woman was standing silently beside the doorframe, her arms crossed firmly over her chest, staring directly back into his soul with terrifying intensity. It was the absolute first time in several decades that Robert Mitchell had physically laid eyes upon the mother he had so ruthlessly abandoned. A violent, microscopic tremor passed over his hardened facial features, an incredibly brief flash of something that was not entirely remorse, but something deeply adjacent to a profound, sickening shame. He quickly masked it with a sneer. "This situation is far from concluded," he spat, turning on his heel and violently shoving himself back into the driver's seat of the truck. But it truly was concluded. The expensive legal team the Mitchells hired to investigate the matter found absolutely zero loopholes to exploit. The city lawyer aggressively defended the deeds, officially declaring that Ethan had operated with total legal clarity and deliberate intention. The sprawling land definitively belonged to Sarah. The substantial funds resting in the private bank account belonged to Sarah. There was absolutely no path to reversal. 6 months later, with young Ethan growing robustly and happily strapped in a sling across her chest, Sarah officially commenced the grand expansion of her property. Utilizing the financial resources Ethan had so carefully hoarded, she began building a permanent life. She selectively hired several hard-working individuals from the scattered mountain community, people who desperately needed fair wages and who respectfully refrained from asking intrusive questions. She hired a capable, quiet young man named David, who proved invaluable with a hammer and a plow. First, they constructed a beautiful, expansive new log home adjacent to Nana Cora's cabin, featuring large windows, multiple warm bedrooms, and a massive wraparound porch where the growing baby could safely practice crawling. Following the house, they erected a sturdy chicken coop, and subsequently, a solid, insulated barn to properly house Lucky and Cora's aging mule against the harsh winters. Then, they turned their focused attention to the rich soil. Nana Cora possessed a masterful understanding of agricultural rhythms. She intimately knew exactly which specific crops would thrive in that high altitude, what essential nutrients the soil demanded, and precisely how to perfectly interpret the shifting weather patterns by simply observing the flight of the mountain hawks. She patiently passed this invaluable knowledge to Sarah, teaching her slowly, with immense patience, holding absolutely nothing back. By the conclusion of their first full agricultural cycle, the newly cultivated fields were producing magnificent yields of sweet corn, hardy mountain beans, and massive squash. By the time 2 full years had passed, Sarah successfully opened a charming, rustic mercantile shop down in the bustling center of Pine Creek. She sold powerful medicinal herbs, healing salves, and natural remedies that Nana Cora meticulously formulated, using the ancient, marginalized knowledge that the ignorant valley elites had previously scoffed at. Initially, the townsfolk approached the wooden counter with profound skepticism. However, skepticism rapidly transformed into absolute loyalty, primarily because the remedies were undeniably effective, and the 2 resilient women from the high ridge always charged a deeply fair price and treated every single customer with genuine respect. It occurred on a chaotic Tuesday afternoon at the town market, nearly 2 years after Sarah had been so cruelly banished from the sprawling estate, with nothing but a battered suitcase and a borrowed horse. She suddenly spotted Alice Mitchell. Her former mother-in-law was lingering near the vegetable stands, attempting to select produce. Alice appeared strikingly different. She looked significantly older, heavily stooped over, moving with the sluggish, agonizing hesitation of someone secretly hauling around an invisible, crushing burden of regret. When Alice finally met Sarah's eyes behind her thriving market stall, she froze. Sarah looked back without anger or triumph, feeling only the quiet peace of someone who had truly moved beyond the pain of the past. Alice slowly approached, her trembling hands clutching an expensive leather purse, and gazed for a long moment at little Ethan sleeping peacefully in a woven basket. Fighting back tears, she whispered that the boy had his father's features. Sarah calmly agreed and revealed his name, Ethan Chayton. Hearing the indigenous family name, Alice visibly flinched, recognizing the heritage her family had spent years trying to erase. Yet she said nothing. Defeated, she simply nodded and disappeared into the crowd without buying a single thing. As Sarah watched her leave, she gently rested a hand on her son's head and remembered her husband's quiet sacrifices, the hidden metal box, the heartfelt letter, the concealed property deeds, and every careful plan he had made to ensure she would never face life alone. She thought of Nana Cora, their flourishing farm, and the peaceful home they had built together after being rejected by the very family that should have protected them. In that moment, Sarah finally understood what Ethan had always known. True love is measured not by staying forever, but by preparing a safe future for those left behind. While the Mitchell family chased wealth and status, they discarded the strongest among them, only to watch them build a life of genuine prosperity. Material power fades, but sacrifice, resilience, and unity create roots that endure. A true legacy is not inherited through a surname or a mansion. It is forged through hardship, nourished by love, and carried forward by those who transform ashes into hope.